All right, thank you everyone for coming out here today for today's discussion on Jurassic Park. We're talking an adventure 33 years in the making. Now, what does that mean? You're probably saying to yourself, well, I don't understand. The movie is 30 years old. Well, the book is actually 33 years old. If you didn't know, just some by the numbers. Sorry, one moment here. Oops, sorry. Of course, we've got our logo here. We'll talk about the logo in just a bit. I'm sure we're all familiar with this. This is the movie logo. It doesn't quite match the logo in the book, but it's actually very on the cover of the book, but it's very, very, very close. But anyway, of course, we're here to talk about Jurassic Park, the novel, although we will talk a little bit about the movie in this presentation. But just by the numbers, so if you weren't aware, Jurassic Park was initially published on November 20th, 1990. Of course, it was written by Michael Crichton. Certainly, he's a well-known author. He passed away, I believe, in 2008 or 2009. But regardless, he wrote this book in 1990, and it was written by him, and it was published by Alfred A. Knopf. They're still a publisher even to this day. They're part of Penguin Random House. Lately, I've only found in our catalog that they've been publishing children's books, but regardless, they was published by Alfred A. Knopf. For Michael Crichton, this was released between two of his other books, Sphere, written in 1987, and Rising Sun, which was written in 1992. Interestingly, Rising Sun had a movie adaptation, which also came out in 1993, the same year as Jurassic Park. It starred Sean Connery and I believe Wesley Snipes, which was interesting. I was also not aware that Sphere was written prior to Jurassic Park. I assume Sphere was written afterwards. Of course, we're probably, some of us may be familiar with the late 90s adaptation of Sphere, which was an okay movie. I thought it bordered a little bit too much on Forbidden Planet, but regardless, he wrote Sphere, he wrote Jurassic Park, and then he wrote Rising Sun amongst his other bibliographies. Um, per Publishers Weekly, I found a listing on their website. It spent 12 weeks on the bestsellers list. That's pretty good for a novel. And in fact, it was the 18th best-selling novel of 1990, even though it was only out for like a little less than 2 months. It came out on November 20th. Between November 20th and the end of 1990, it was the 18th best-selling novel, and it sold 230,000 copies in the span of 2 months. By contrast, the book that was the bestseller for 1990s told as a whole, I don't recall the exact title, but it was by Stephen King, and I think that Stephen King book only sold 4 million copies, so you can tell that Jurassic Park was just a runaway bestseller. By 1999, it had gone to press over 100 times and had 12 million copies printed in the United States alone. The copy of the book I got through our library system was, I think it was like the 18th edition, which I guess is different than printing, but regardless, they printed a lot of copies. And according to the back of my book copy that I have here, some excerpts from Kirkus Reviews, who were the first ones to write an advanced review of the book, said that it's a tornado-paced tale, fast, furious, and suspenseful, a vastly entertaining science thriller, and a surefire bestseller, which, as we can see, yes, it was. The link back down there. I'll show the presentation after this is over, but basically, yeah, that was Publishers Weekly had published an article in 1999 reflecting on how well the novel had done up until that point. So what about some prehistory, though? Prehistory for getting to how do we get to Jurassic Park? Well, I've never seen this movie, even though I own this movie. If you're not familiar with Westworld, was actually written and directed by Michael Crichton. Yes, Michael Crichton had written a few movies. He'd even directed some, but this is probably the one he was probably most well known for having directed. But basically, Westworld, if you're not familiar with Westworld, was about it was an entertainment theme park similar to Jurassic Park, where instead of dinosaurs, they had robots, they had androids. There was a medieval world, there was Westworld, which is a Western world, and then there was one other one, which I can't recall offhand what it was. But anyway, Westworld was an entertainment theme park that was filled with android robots. And basically, people could go to it and then they could pretend to be like they were the heroes of a Western. They could kill the bad guy. They could rescue the girl, so on and so forth. Well, anyway, the robots started to run amok and got loose and started killing the tourists. So very similar to Jurassic Park. Some people consider Westworld to have been a sort of like basically a baking ground, the initial draft of Jurassic Park. Now, Westworld was never a book. It was turned into a book afterwards, but Crichton didn't write it. But Westworld was written and directed by him because he felt that Westworld worked better as a movie than as a book. Now, as far as Michael Crichton goes, he had wanted to write a dinosaur book throughout the 1980s, but dinosaurs had exploded in popularity, and he did not want to be accused of riding the wave. So basically, he kept putting it off, saying, dinosaur fever is going to die down next year. It's going to die down next year, and then it never did. So then he was finally convinced to finish writing it and to publish it. The initial plot was more about a graduate student cloning a pterosaur or a pterodactyl, but then he realized that, and this was a point mentioned in the book, was that, when it comes to doing this, he's like, well, that doesn't really make much sense. Why would a university put money into cloning a dinosaur? And more importantly, what would be the plot thread? What would be the hook of the book? And that's when he decided to focus to dinosaurs being cloned instead for entertainment, which again, it was a point mentioned in the book about how, you don't make scientific advancements in the university, you make them doing other things, particularly entertainment, because entertainment is not as well regulated as say like, cloning or genetics or things along those lines. Now, the first draft of Jurassic Park was actually originally centered around the perspective of children. I presume that means Lex and Tim. I've not read the first draft. I'm not familiar. Obviously, that's never saw print. But, the editors and Michael Crichton both felt that after reviewing it, that it really worked better from an adult perspective, that, it couldn't just be the children's view of this, that, and everything else. So the book was then, rewritten to a degree. Now, some other things to mention would be the Lost World novel by Arthur Conan Doyle, but written in 1912. Of course, the Lost World would later be used by Michael Crichton as the title of the sequel to Jurassic Park. That was about a group of scientists who went to, and also adventurers who went to a plateau, I believe was in Africa, was in the book. I unfortunately have not read the book myself, but I need to. But anyway. So yeah, the Lost World novel is about scientists and adventurers going to find a lost plateau where dinosaurs are found to live. The Lost World silent film later came out in 1925, which was based on the book. This is notable for a couple of reasons. One, it's probably one of the very earliest dinosaur movies ever made. Two, it's considered to be the first full-length feature film ever made in the United States, if Wikipedia is to be believed. And more also, it was also the first movie to ever be shown on an airplane, I believe that same year. And as they pointed out in this article I read, planes were made out of wood and balsa. They were made out of wood in those days, and the film stock was considered highly flammable. So you were sort of taking a risk showing a movie on a plane in those days. But how far things have come. But the Lost World is mostly famous because it had a brontosaurus running loose through London at the end, and people consider it to be extremely realistic. The special effects, I believe, were done with Willis O'Brien, who later on went on to do King Kong in 1933. Another movie, which I'm not going to talk too much about, is called When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. That was a movie done by Hammer, who were, they were sort of like they were basically a horror film company in London. Well, they made a movie called When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth. We probably recognize this for two reasons. One, because this was not a modern day setting for this movie, unlike The Lost World. This was a movie that took place, in prehistoric times, sort of like, 10 million BC and all that. But basically, this movie had a lot of special effects. It captured Steven Spielberg's imagination, but more so, When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth was not only that banner that was held at the top of the visitor center in the movie that fell down at the end in front of the Tyrannosaur, but it was also a chapter of one of the in this book, in Jurassic Park the book, there was a chapter called When Dinosaurs Ruled the Earth, just as an homage to it. This final book, which I really want to read sometime, I'm not saying this had anything to do with how Michael Crichton formed Jurassic Park, but there was another book called Carnosaur, which was written in 1984 by Harry Adam Knight, which is a pseudonym of John Brosnan, who was an Australian writer. He wrote a book which was all about dinosaurs in modern day London and modern day England. What's interesting is, there are some parallels between what he wrote and what was written in Jurassic Park, whereas basically a scientist was taking dinosaur DNA, cloning it and putting it into chicken eggs as a way to then make dinosaurs and rule the earth again. Again, it's just interesting, the similarities in the plots. Obviously, Jurassic Park is not a ripoff of Carnosaur, because Crichton had already been writing it at that point. But this was later turned into a Roger Corman movie, which Roger Corman tried to get it out. He was a B movie. He had movies with very low budgets. But anyway, Carnosaur, he rushed it out into theaters when he heard about Jurassic Park. And that movie also came out in 1993, starring Diane Ladd, who is who was the mother of I'm blanking on names now, but regardless, who was the mother of Laura Dern, who played Ellie Sattler in Jurassic Park. That's an interesting connection between the two. Unfortunately, Carnosaur is really hard to see on DVD, but I saw all the movies and they were interesting. They were very low budget, and they were, to a degree, they weren't so I didn't think they were that good, but it was interesting to watch, and I really need to read this book sometime. Of course, my favorite dinosaur book that came out around that time would be Dinotopia by James Gurney. If you ever have the chance to read this, this is both a book with a lot of lavish illustrations. I really enjoyed Dinotopia. It's about an island with dinosaurs on it, but the dinosaurs are more or less in peaceful harmony with humans. It's a utopia with dinosaurs in it, hence it's a Dinotopia. And like I said, I really enjoyed this book, and I enjoyed the sequels as well. Now let's talk a little bit about the logo, which we saw earlier. Jurassic Park logo was designed by Knopf, their in-house illustrator, or one of them, Chip Kidd. Chip Kidd, based the logo on a T-Rex skeleton, which is drawn by paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn. And we'll see a photo of that in just a moment. And also Kidd's visit to the New York Museum of Natural History. He lived in New York. He thought, well, you know what, I could read books, but I could just go down to the Museum of Natural History and look at a dinosaur skeleton myself and look at the books in the store. But anyway, so yeah, Michael Crichton really loved the logo when he saw it. It's just so basic, just a T-Rex skeleton, but he faxed Kidd telling him so. I can't say what Crichton wrote in that fax because there was an expletive, but that's just how excited he was about the logo. So the logo would, of course, be reused for the subsequent Jurassic Park films. There's a couple links here talking about, how the logo came to be. Chip Kidd also has his own website, which I didn't link here. But anyway, here's the on the left there, we have the skeletal diagram done in 1917 of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, published by paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn. This came from one of the two links on the previous pages. But then, of course, next to it, we have that juxtaposed with the novel of Jurassic Park, and you definitely see the similarities between the two. What's interesting is, because this was written before they did more research into how they were going to portray the dinosaurs, of course we can see that T-Rex is basically standing like a human would, because in those days, and that's how people thought dinosaurs were. They stood upright like a human would and dragged their tails behind them. Versus what we saw in the movie, where the dinosaurs were more horizontal than they were vertical. But you can definitely see the similarities between the two. For those of you who have the hardcover edition of the book, it has more of the skeleton past what we see here on the front cover, and it does very much match the drawing on the left. But of course, we can see some differences between the two. But it's just a fun little, it's fun that it was based off of that, and it's a very iconic logo that, again, was later used in the films. Even to the last Jurassic World film, they still use that logo. So moving on to the movie just a little bit. So the original draft of Jurassic Park, the movie, well, if you didn't know, Michael Crichton, the author, was actually tasked to write the first draft of Jurassic Park. He was a little reluctant to do it because he'd sort of gotten out of the screenwriting game at that point, but he agreed to do it. He was also paid very well for it. I think he was paid like $500,000 just to do the draft. So he did an original draft, and the draft for the film, which you can find online, I have a link to a little bit later on, was, it had some elements of the book that were not present in the film, one of which was the rafting sequence, which is a good portion of the book that did not show up at all in the movie because it probably wasn't good for pacing reasons, but this draft had the rafting sequence in it. What's also interesting is Ian Malcolm is completely absent from this draft. His dialogue and injuries have been given to Gennaro, who was the lawyer, which is interesting because I think later on Crichton said that the character that he related to the most was Ian Malcolm, but Malcolm is just completely absent in the first draft of Jurassic Park, the movie. The draft is basically a starting point. It was then handed to David Koepp, who revised and finished it. And if you're ever watching the movie, if you look at the beginning credits, I think, or at the very least at the end, it says that the screenplay was credited to both David Koepp and Michael Crichton, although of course the story is based on Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. But that's just interesting that he also wrote the book, but also wrote the first draft of the movie. And there's a couple links there to a couple websites which have the original script of Jurassic Park. Jurassic Outpost actually has a couple other drafts. I only really skimmed the first draft. So let's talk about, I want to show you some movie concept art. The reason why I want to show you that is because you can see that it's got some parallels to what we saw in the book, because when they were making the movie, they took elements out of the book that they thought were the most interesting. They made some concept art to show, like, for proof of concept for the movie, even though some of these sequences, again, were not actually in the finalized movie themselves. And we see that with this first piece of concept art, which is probably one of the most infamous ones. This is infamous because, of course, we can see the rafting sequence. The rafting sequence was seriously considered to be in the movie, but it was ultimately dropped. But you can see, like, here we've got, of course, we've got Grant, who's actually much younger than he was portrayed in the book. Maybe by this point they'd settled on a younger scientist. But then we can also see, here's Lex and Tim, and this was done in a time when Tim was still going to be older than Lex. But now there was a reason for that, which they all discuss afterwards, why their ages were swapped. But basically, yes, for the longest time, Tim, of course, like in the movie concept art, was older than Lex. And here you can see the T-Rex in the background, though, as we may remember from the book, this is not how this played out in the book itself. They went off a waterfall onto the T-Rex. They were not in the rapids with the T-Rex, but it's an exciting piece of concept art, and it's one that's and captured my imagination since I first saw it in a book back around when the original movie was coming out. So here's another one. This will come into play a little bit later, but this was also another one of the T-Rex chasing Grant, Lex, and Tim. Again, Tim is much older than Lex in this concept art. And again, this is just a fun, interesting sequence. I don't know if this maybe had been based off of the sequence in the book with a juvenile T-Rex that was going to chase after our heroes. Although we never saw that chase in the book, I think it was just partly alluded to. We saw the Rex notice them, but then by that point they're in the jungle and the Rex is nowhere to be found. So maybe it didn't chase after them after Godhead Regis. This is another one, again, with a younger Lex and an older Tim. I like this one for a couple of reasons. One is this appears to still be a more vertical standing T-Rex than the horizontal one, but this is also drawn with, they were going to use Range Rover or Land Rovers. In the book, they were a Land Rover, and there was a notable sequence where the T-Rex bit the rear tire and exploded in its face. But this was an exciting piece of concept art, and again, I saw in a book a long time ago, which I'll show what that book is a little bit later on. But anyway, this is a piece of concept art that, again, more closely mirrors the book, with the various windows broken and the rear tire, which we can see in this drawing. This sequence was this concept art almost happened in the movie. We remember in the book, Lex decided that when she saw the baby a Triceratops, she wondered, well, I bet he would let me ride him if I really wanted to. And Grant was able to dissuade her from actually riding the Triceratops. Well, in the movie, they were seriously considering having Lex ride a Triceratops during the same sequence with the adult who was tranquilized because it was sick. They even went so far as to make a full-sized baby Triceratops for Lex to ride on, but then they realized that as soon as they made it, the decision was made to drop that sequence of Lex riding the Triceratops. But the prop later showed up in the Lost World movie. But anyway, here's Lex riding the Triceratops, and here's Tim up in a tree feeding a bunch of baby brachiosaurs. I can't tell from this if Tim is now younger. He almost seems like he's younger now, and Lex is a little bit taller. So this was done later on in the movie when they probably decided to swap their ages. The reason why the ages were swapped in the movie versus the book is because Joseph Mazzello had auditioned for Hook, which Steven Spielberg directed. Well, Steven Spielberg didn't pick Joseph Mazzello to be in Hook, but he did say, he did promise him. He said, what, the next movie that I do, you'll be in it. And the next movie was Jurassic Park. So Joseph Mazzello he was only like, I don't know, 10 or 12 maybe at the time, but since he was so young, they couldn't have Lex be even younger, so they basically casted Lex as Ariana Richards, so she was older. So that's why their ages are swapped, because again, Steven Spielberg promised Joseph Mazzello a role in Jurassic Park, and he got it. So anyway, this is a fun piece of concept art because, and I'd sort of forgotten this till I read the book for this book discussion, was the Velociraptors are described as having stripes like tiger stripes. They're described as having tiger stripes. Well, in the concept art that we can see here, they did have tiger stripes. This was in the visitor center, and here's interesting. On the left, we see a stegosaurus skeleton instead of the T-Rex and brachiosaur skeletons that we saw in the movie. But yes, they were going to have the tiger stripes on the raptors, and this is one of the more famous or more well-known pieces of concept art for the movie where they showed that. But as we know from the movie itself, this was done away with. These raptors did not have tiger stripes in the movie. But what's interesting is here's our only glimpse of a stegosaur skeleton. Of course, the stegosaur never showed up in the Jurassic Park movie. It only showed up in the Lost World. But what's interesting is in the book, though, the book didn't have a T-Rex skeleton or a brachiosaur skeleton in the visitor center. Instead, they had a robot T-Rex. Now, I don't know that there's any proof of this, but I read online that there might have been a consideration to have that Grant use the robot T-Rex to fight off the velociraptors. I don't know that there's any truth to that, because the first draft of Jurassic Park, the movie, just has Grant dropping a skeleton on one of them. The last one that's still alive, there was no mention of the robot T-Rex. So I think that's probably just like, made up, just one of those things of the internet. But it's interesting that there was a robot T-Rex in the book, and there may have been consideration to have a robot T-Rex in the movie, but nothing came of it. Here's another photo later on of the Velociraptor. We can see it's starting to lose those tiger stripes. It's much less pronounced here. And in fact, I think later on it became even less pronounced in the film, because I really don't remember much of these stripes at all in the movie. What's interesting is, and this is backwards because of this concept art, it says this dinosaur is not a raptor, but a Deinonychus. When they were doing the movie, the raptors are in real life, raptors are actually really, really tiny. They're probably about the size of a turkey. But later when they were making the movie, there was a discovery of what's called a Utah raptor, and a Utah raptor is about as tall as the velociraptors we saw in the movie. But it's interesting that this says Deinonychus, because Deinonychus is a huge raptor-like creature that looks very similar to this. I've later seen concept art where this is rewritten as Velociraptor, so I don't know what the story is there. But anyway, Deinonychus is another raptor creature that looks similar to a raptor. It's just much bigger than a raptor. Now, what this is near and dear to my heart. This was a toy that they made for the Jurassic Park movie. This is actually, now as we know in the movie, there was no juvenile T-Rex. There was very much one in the book. We saw it show up a couple times. But anyway, this is the juvenile T-Rex, and I had this toy as a kid. This was like the only really dinosaur toy I can ever recall owning from the movie, because I was much more into vehicles than I was into dinosaurs. But so I had some of the Jurassic Park vehicles, but this was the only dinosaur I owned. I still have this somewhere. It's certainly out of the box, but yeah, this was the young T-Rex. They also made an adult T-Rex, the bull T-Rex, but they definitely made a young T-Rex toy, even though there's no allusions or no reference to it there being a juvenile T-Rex in the movie at all. So like I said, yes, the young T-Rex did live as a toy from the original Jurassic Park movie. Another fun thing is they made a number of video games based off of Jurassic Park, and in the Jurassic Park games for the Sega Genesis, the rafting sequence did make it in there, although only Grant is the one on the raft. And in case this raft is also it's more of a motorboat than a raft. But anyway, this is sequence. You could go through the river, the T-Rex would attack you. This level was a nightmare for me to complete as a kid for reasons I won't go into. This was a very difficult level because you had to be very precise with your movements, because if you go too fast off of this waterfall here, you'll hit this little branches and then you'll die. And if the T-Rex eats you, you'll also die. So this was a very hard level. The sequel game to this, called Jurassic Park Rampage Edition, also had a rafting sequence. It was much easier, but it was also a lot more confusing about where you were supposed to go. But that's the story for another day. Maybe if I would just do a general Jurassic Park presentation. Now, of course, something has survived. Later on, I think in '95, I believe, Crichton wrote the Lost World sequel. This is the only sequel book that he ever wrote in his lifetime. This is the only sequel he ever wrote. When I attended a Steven Spielberg film class in college, my professor said that she wrote this book because Spielberg asked him to, because Spielberg was basically contracted to sort of make the sequel to Jurassic Park, and he didn't have anything to base it off of. So he asked Crichton, please write The Lost World, and Crichton agreed. And so this is The Lost World, which maybe we'll discuss another time. But anyway, yeah, I really like the tagline for this, something has survived, although I don't know that the movie or in the book even sort of saw that come to fruition, because something did survive. It was just on a different island. But anyway, you can see this is still a riff on the original Jurassic Park logo. We can see the head, we can see the arms, but that's just interesting. Regardless, Tina or Kathy Bowman, she was Tina in the book, she was Kathy in the movie. She got attacked by a bunch of compies. But she survived in both cases, but still, she certainly got more than she bargained for with her sandwich. And then of course, on the lighter side, we had Gary Larson, who loved doing things about dinosaurs. And when he saw Jurassic Park, of course, out of Jurassic Park, we got Jurassic Parking. So even dinosaurs have to go looking for their cars after work. And then if you ever want some further reading, the book on the left, I've had for a long time, although I've had to rebuy it because I don't know what happened to my original copy. But The Making of Jurassic Park was made while the movie was coming out. It was written by Don Shea and Jody Duncan. This book was actually in the movie, if you can believe that. It's got a different cover, but during the sequence where they're panning through all the Jurassic Park toys over to Richard Attenborough when he's alone in the dining room, when Laura Dern finds him, when he's eating the ice cream, while they're panning through all these toys, well, they actually show this book with a different cover, but it also has the author's names on it. So that's just interesting that how meta that is, about a book about the making of Jurassic Park is actually in the movie Jurassic Park. More recently, within the past year or so, they made a Jurassic Park, The Ultimate Visual History. This book was written as a retrospective of the first 3 Jurassic Park movies, and then they later made a different edition for Jurassic World, or a different book for Jurassic World. This is fun little props and stuff in it. I think like Nedry's key card is in it and stuff. But anyway, these are a couple books I would recommend that you read if you can. Again, The Making of Jurassic Park covers a little bit about the book. Some of the stuff I talked about earlier about Crichton is in there. And then The Ultimate Visual History is here. Although what you'll notice with this cover is we saw that earlier image of the older Lex, or the older Tim and the younger Lex. Well, they sort of repurposed this concept art. This part with the T-Rex in the background is all the same from that original concept art, but now they've redone this part of it so that this guy looks a lot more like Sam Neill. This definitely looks like Ariana Richards as an older Lex, and of course Joseph Mazzello is the younger Tim. So I didn't even notice that until I was putting this presentation together. I got a good laugh out of that. But anyway, there's a couple of books for you. That's the end of our presentation. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And so, yeah, and I appreciate, and we'll just go ahead and get started talking about the books. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and that'll allow you to unmute yourselves. And yeah, we'll have a good discussion, and then maybe we'll talk about all things Jurassic Park. So I'm going to stop the recording. And with that, we will get moving.